This is The Bagel Report, a podcast exploring Jewish representation and identity in popular culture, with your hosts Esther Kostanowitz and Aaron Ben-Moshe, and now a production of J, the Jewish News of Northern California.
Esther, we are not alone in the virtual studio today.
Nope, we have a guest.
V, welcome to The Bagel Report. We're so happy to have you here.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
And she is just V. That's all you need to know. V.
So I have the YouTube channel SnappyDragon, which is, I guess, where most people would know me from. I talk about fashion history. I talk about how clothes form part of human history. I talk about period dramas and TV shows. I make things sometimes. That's what I do over there.
Yeah, it's great. We've been watching some of your videos, and it's fascinating work that you do. We're very interested in the entirety of it. So one of the things that we're interested in is we know that you've been working with the Jewish Writers Initiative Fellowship, and I'm curious to know how being part of this fellowship has expanded your work or taken it in some sort of new direction. Because I know that a lot of this stuff you were doing before, this fashion history. Just tell us a little bit about how you got interested in the subject matter and how your JWI work expands on your previous work.
Cool. So the Jewish Writers Initiative, the fellowship, this particular one that I was part of is called the Digital Storytelling Lab. They've done one previously that's for like feature film screenwriters, and they're going to do another one for feature film screenwriters. What they did for me, essentially, and I'll tell you the story of how I applied for this. A week before the deadline, a really good friend of mine sends me the link to their website. I've never heard of them before. And says, hey, I don't have the time to apply for this, or I would, but you should. And I look at it and I think, okay, YouTube has only recently become my full-time job. I've never been somebody who applies for grants or anything. I don't have a background in media at all. The start of my channel was me and a sewing machine and a smartphone. That's my background. I'm not formally trained in any of this, not costuming, not film, not history. I'm self-taught. So I figure, okay, well, if I apply to this thing, I'm going to have to update my resume. They want a resume, and I need to update my resume anyways now that this is my job. I might as well throw something together. And I've had this project sort of cooking in the back of my head, like, oh, it would be nice to reproduce my ancestors' clothes and talk about what that means for me and do all of that research. But I don't want to do it until I can do a good job of it. So I write up that project, and that's what I send in. And I figure I'll never hear from them again. I've looked at the bios of their previous fellows. I'm never going to hear from them again. I'm just a woman with a camera. I heard from them again. And a lot of what they did for me, like, yes, they provided production funding. They provided a lot of resources. They made a lot of connections. They introduced me to the cinematographer I worked with in the Bay Area. But really what it was about was the fact that they took me and like put me in a room with these incredible creators and said, you are as legitimate as these people. You are not just a woman with a camera. You ought to be taken seriously. So you take yourself seriously, and we're going to make sure your work gets the notice it should. And a lot of what they've done has been introducing me to this field of media production that I don't have a background in and have found myself in accidentally. This was my first project ever working with the crew because they were able to make those introductions with me and provide those resources. And I feel like the most valuable thing I got out of it was just being in a room with these other creators and the conversations we had, feeling like I belong in this field and like I can take my work less in the direction of just being a person with a sewing machine who likes to talk about their projects and more in the direction of being a storyteller and a filmmaker.
I love it so much because I think like you are a storyteller. Like I think when people think of storytellers, they think of directors or actors or writers, but costumers are telling a story. There's so much research that goes into it. And the fact that like you're saying that like I was just a creator, I was just a youth, like I didn't even know, but someone is saying to you, this is so legit. Like, what did that feel like for you?
I still haven't fully internalized it. They had to do a lot of hand-holding and being like, no, just send the email. Put yourself out there. It's okay. And then I would go back and be like, I don't know how to write this kind of email. I've never had to write this kind of email. How do I write this kind of email? But also, it was having pointed out to me by the folks in the fellowship, by the cinematographer I worked with, by all of those people that when you're a YouTuber, especially when you're a YouTuber that does everything yourself, you're not attached to some studio or something, you are the writer and the director and the cinematographer and the presenter and the editor and all of those hats all at once. So in addition to the costuming piece, it's feeling like the writing aspect of my work, which has always been my favorite. That feels much more legitimate now. And it feels like I've gotten a lot better at it through being part of this.
I'm wondering, this is not on our list of approved questions, but I'm going rogue. This happens from time to time. It's a very, very wild question. When you were growing up, did you know that this was an area of interest for you? Do you remember the first costume or actual piece of clothing that made an impression on you?
I can't necessarily name a piece of clothing for you, but I can tell you the story of how this became an interest for me. I was always interested in fashion. I was always interested in dressing up. I played dress up all the time as a kid, and my parents were horrified because they are very academic, kind of snobby types. And it's very ironic because my ancestors worked in the garment trade. And instead of seeing that as a form of legitimate work that was very hard, but it's what our ancestors did so we could have the nice things we have, they looked down on it. And they looked down on fashion, and they looked down on anything that wasn't suitably intellectual. So my mother was horrified to have a daughter that liked pink. But I also grew up going to science fiction conventions. And one of the things I admired most about the people I would see there, like me running around 12 years old, running errands for the people that are running the show, is all of the people that would show up in these incredibly elaborate costumes. We're talking everything from historical to fantasy, cosplay from shows, just things they wanted to make. And it was incredible. I looked up to these people so much. And I always sort of thought to myself, I would like to be that when I grow up. I just didn't see a way to it because I was growing up in this environment where that was not seen as a good or worthy thing to do with your time. Fashion and beauty were considered frivolous and a waste of time and looked down on in the way a lot of traditionally feminine interests are. I did learn to use a sewing machine, and I think the best way to describe my family's attitude towards that is that I come from a long line of short people. And it is cheaper to hem up your own pants than to pay someone else to do it. That's why I was taught how to use a sewing machine. I was not taught to make clothes. I was not taught anything about fashion. That I ended up learning for myself. And I only really got into it in 2019 when I'd had a breakup and I needed something really good to focus my energy on. And I ended up saying to myself, well, you've always wanted to do this. You've been watching all of these getting dressed videos on YouTube, like the people that I come up in search results with now. I was watching all of those people and I thought, you know what? It's time you learn to do this. You can do it. And I started making historical dresses for myself.
That's amazing. I only recently started appreciating, but noticing the detail that goes into the cosplay outfits. I was just at the Ren Fair and I was looking at these costumes, and my good friend, she makes all of her costumes by hand, and she bought a couple pieces, but everybody there just cares so deeply about the pieces and what they symbolize and what they mean. And ever since that, I've really started noticing in pop culture, all of these little costume pieces. I guess my question for you is, at what point did you start making costumes and then think about your family story and how you just started creating your great-grandmother's, your great-great-grandmother's outfits? How did that come to be, where you connected what you like doing and making it more like a family tree thing?
So it comes back to being Jewish in the historical costuming world. And there was not really much Jewish presence there, I don't think, not very visibly at least. There are, I think, a lot of Jews who make historical costumes, not a lot of people who necessarily make Jewish historical costumes. There was one project I did. It was actually my first YouTube video to get sent around and rack up a whole bunch of views. I had come across this throwaway mention on someone's blog about medieval clothing for the SCA saying, oh, and Jewish women in this time in this place wore this particular style of headscarf. It was the first mention I had seen in any sort of historical costuming contest of like, oh yeah, and by the way, Jews were there, which was huge for me. It was huge for me because I'd had this experience my whole life of like reading historical media and feeling like in order to identify with the main characters, I had to separate myself, like pointedly forget that I had a Jewish identity. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to see myself in the story. So that feeling of being able to see where you might have been in history was incredibly powerful. And it was made even more powerful by the fact that there was plenty of casual anti-Semitism in that community. Like people would be academically like, of course, fine with Jews until it affected them in any way or until they had to look at what being Jewish actually is about. And then they would be really uncomfortable. So my response to that, being the very stubborn person I am, has been to say, oh, this makes you uncomfortable? I'm getting even more Jewish. And a lot of my Jewish identity has developed through this historical research, through learning more about the cultural aspects, through making clothing. So the idea to reproduce my ancestors' clothes is one of those things that once it came into my head, it was so obvious and so natural, I couldn't imagine not doing it once it had crossed my mind, because it really did feel like the people around me making these costumes were coming from a sense of seeing themselves in history, seeing who they would have been in the past. And I didn't have that. But obviously my ancestors were there. I had to have come from somewhere. So where was that?
Right. And I'm wondering if you can help us, well, because we talk about Jewish representation in pop culture here all the time. That's really one of our main beats, if there are still beats. I don't think we're not going to come back to that going to the Renaissance Fair thing that you just slipped in there that you didn't tell me about, Erin. But we'll do that another time. I have
things to say about that as well.
Right. About the period accuracy and that kind of stuff. Is that what you have things to say about that? Maybe we should just do that now.
I mean, accuracy, yes, just not in the direction most people expect.
Oh, okay.
Ooh, say more.
Okay, so I made a video about this last year. So I absolutely love Renaissance fairs, and why I love Renaissance fairs is that they are not necessarily historically accurate. The participant costumes, the performers will have like a certain set of standards that they adhere to for whatever vibe the fair wants to evoke. But what I love about it is that it's this environment where people are encouraged to just play and dress up in Renaissance stuff and fantasy stuff and cosplays. And it's really encouraging of new folks, of folks that are just there to have fun and not so worried about the academic of it. Folks that are maybe interested in the history, but it's environment that if they're showing up as a customer, it's not going to shame them or judge them because they couldn't afford to use real wool or something like that. So I love that environment so much. And I'm actually going to be teaching a class later this summer with MyJewishLearning on Jewish Ren Fair costuming and how to make that experience feel Jewish rather than just feel like dressing up.
Amazing. Love that. We're also wondering, I know Erin and I are both wondering this, about your decision to recreate a dress in the style of your great-great-grandmother would have worn on the Lower East Side in 1880. And this is connected to your YouTube series, The Clothes on Their Backs.
It is, yeah.
And so you were also talking about the fact that in the times that you'd seen this period depicted on screen, you hadn't seen Jews represented. So I'm wondering if you can characterize for us what Jewish clothing would have looked like and if you would have recognized it when you saw it.
So the tricky thing, and this is the ongoing question that comes through all of my Jewish clothing recreations. It is not well documented what Jewish people in a certain society, time, place were wearing that is different or not different from the non-Jewish people in that same time, place, area, unless it's identifying dress, unless it's like the medieval veil that I reproduced, which is a form of legally mandated identifying dress that was meant to mark Jews as being outsiders. And the reason I reproduced that one specifically is at the very least it was based on some elements of dress that come from within the Jewish community. So it didn't feel as much like it would be a traumatic thing to wear. But in some place like the Lower East Side in the 1880s, it wouldn't necessarily just be about Jewish clothing. It would be about whether you looked American or not. It would be about, like, were you wearing the clothes you brought from the old country, or were you wearing clothes in the style of the old country, wherever that was? Or had you gotten or made American clothes? So part of the idea of this dress is to make something that my great-great-grandmother, she arrives in the U.S. end of 1880, and she's able to work and she's able to save up some money and she's able to make herself a new best dress, and she wants something that looks American. She wants to fit in. And even in the Lower East Side, even in a neighborhood that was really, really heavily populated by immigrants, there was this drive socially to become American, if you could. So there are little elements of the dress I made that reflect the fact that Carolina, she's coming from Hungary. She's most likely fairly Orthodox. During this time period, you see sometimes on high fashion day dresses, there's like a lower square neckline, or the sleeves are only elbow length. And I figured that's not going to fit with her standards of modesty, because even the elbow-length sleeves, which are today considered pretty modest, were pretty daring during that time for daytime. Like, maybe not for evening, but for daytime, that was a lot on display. And that low square neckline, definitely not. So the dress I made for her, it's got a really high collar, like up above my collarbones. The sleeves go all the way to the wrists. And I also felt really lucky to find these antique from the 19th century, like brass buttons that had a 6-pointed star embossed on them.
Wow.
I don't know the history of those buttons. I don't know whether it was intended to be a Magen David or not, but they were perfect. So I found them in a Facebook group where people trade supplies back and forth, and that's where I got them.
Boy, there's like a Facebook group for everything, isn't there? I wouldn't even know where to start with trying to recreate the clothes that my ancestors wore in their various places, and also layer in the idea of how religious they were being an influence and what kind of fashion they had. And I'm also, I know that when you're talking about time periods and fashion, you're also talking about society, class, race, ethnicity. And you spoke a little bit about, Jews being outsiders and that being reflected in their dress. But I know you've also used the Gilded Age, HBO's series, as a point of pop culture analysis. So I'm wondering if you can tell us what, for instance, that time period's essential fashion elements are, and what they mean about society, class, race, ethnicity, and where the Jews fit into all of that.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing about the Gilded Age, it's set in 1882 in a neighborhood in New York. And the reason I wanted to talk about it, especially in the series, The Clothes on Their Backs, is that is the same time period that my great-great-grandmother was in New York. So I think it's like less than 4 miles apart from where the show is set is where she lived. And that overlap and the idea of like, well, she was there, but she's not going to show up on screen because this is a show about rich people. What's interesting is the fashions they've chosen. They have like these big shelf-shaped bustles on the dresses. And the fashions they've chosen are actually 3 to 4 years ahead of the time period the show is set. 1882 was the tail end of a period that modern costumers often call the natural form period. It wasn't a term that was used at the time, but it's what we call it now because we need a name for the little 5-year period between 1878 and 1883, where people got sick of the big sloped bustles in the 1870s and wanted to do something different. So they had no bustles for about 5 years. And then after 1883, bustles got really big again. So in that respect, the costumes on the show are not necessarily perfectly reflective of the time period, but it's a much more recognizable look. So they understand why they wanted to go for that with the visual identity that they're trying to create. So it was fashionable during that time. You would see these dress bodices with sometimes the high neckline and long sleeves, sometimes the lower square neckline and shorter sleeves during the day. Evening, you would usually see like a very low, wide neckline, little short sleeves, sometimes sleeveless. And the skirt shape was not bustled. You would have like maybe a little bit of fluff in the back, but it was very straight up and down. And for high fashion, they would just cover it in trim and decorations and drapery and all of this. And then the shape of the top, the bodice, would be very closely fitted, very hourglassy sort of waist. And then the top of the dress would extend past the natural waist down over the hips. Sometimes you'd even see a dress that was still two pieces, top and skirt, but the top would be like almost knee length and then just the underskirts peeking out. That was what was high fashion. Most people literally could not afford to wear fashionable clothes. It's not like it is today, where it's a question of taste and style and choosing pieces, and you can still be fashionable and stylish on a tight budget. You literally couldn't afford high fashion materials, most people. Like, there's a reason my great-great-grandmother's dress is made out of a printed cotton. It's got a bunch of different colors on it, which would be a little more expensive, but there's no way on earth that she can afford silk. There's no way on earth she can afford these more complicated like contrast trims, velvet ribbon. She literally can't buy that. And so there were much more limits on being able to look at somebody and see at a glance, like, what is this person's socioeconomic status? What can they afford? What can't they afford? What quality is their fabric? How fashionable is the shape of their dress? Things like that. So something like what I reproduced for my great-great-grandmother Carolina, which it's a printed cotton, little bit of a nicer printed cotton because it's got several colors on it, but still a printed cotton overall. It's sheet material. It's got the fitted bodice. It's a nice stylish cut. She's got a simple overskirt drapery, but not something complicated. And that would have been a splurge for her to buy the extra fabric to make that. And then the skirt has a ruffled trim on the bottom made out of the same fabric. That's it for decoration. And it's got the cute brass buttons. That is her best dress. That's the nicest thing she can afford. She wears that on Shabbat. She doesn't wear that every day. For a middle-class woman, that's just like a regular dress. It's not a getting messy doing the housework dress, but it's definitely not a nice dress. And a rich person is never going to wear something so plain as that. That's what you could tell just looking at somebody. And being able to tell that much at a glance was just another axis on which all of the prejudices that existed in 19th century society would come out. So there were absolutely instances of Black people facing really abusive treatment if they were dressed well. Because white supremacy was very much in the norm, and not just in the South. And there were plenty of people who didn't think Black people should have nice clothes. It was seen as being above their station in that respect. And it was interesting, in the 1890s, so 10, 15 years later, we get the Sears Roebuck catalog, and that ends up making a huge difference because if you were a Black American, you did not have to worry about going into the shop and somebody refusing to sell you something or refusing to serve you because they thought what you wanted to buy was nicer than you ought to have. You place a mail order, nobody knows anything about who you are other than you're the person that placed this mail order. It doesn't matter. You also don't necessarily have to worry about, and just like, imagine being in a situation where you have to worry about this. You don't have to worry about the local white supremacists, who could be a large proportion of your town, depending on where you were, thinking you had something nicer than you ought to have in your house because you'd bought it from a local shop and using it as an excuse for mob violence. So that is really how society's prejudices would have come out. And it would have been along all of the usual axes of class and race and gender if you weren't dressed modestly enough. And Jews ended up fitting into this in this sort of interesting place of some assimilating and some not, and some having the option of assimilating and some not so much. And German Jews who were more reform, who were more secular, who were more on the side of assimilating would end up like looking down or being very embarrassed of the Eastern European Jews who were showing up and not looking American, not acting American, and really, really wanted these people to assimilate because they were worried it would like cause problems for the entirety of the Jewish people in America.
I love what you're saying. I mean, obviously not the oppression part. That's awful. And it still feels relevant today for some reason, which sucks. But what I do love is that class and assimilation is such an important thing when it comes to fashion in certain time periods. And pivoting to the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, I feel like you can totally tell what part of the city you're in and which family you're hanging out with because of these things. And I wonder for you what it was like watching, okay, it's like a two-parter question. What was it like seeing the Maisels and the Weissmans together in a scene? If you could tell the difference between the clothing they were wearing, and what it was like for the extras, for the people that are walking around in Midge's life where she looks a certain way, she's perceived as a certain way, but everybody around her is wearing something different.
Yeah. As far as the Maisels versus the Weissmans, I think I noticed a little bit more in their behavior, the idea of being assimilated versus not. And I think part of that is because the Weissmans or the Maisels run a clothing factory. So they are generally very fashionable and very well dressed because that's their business. Of course they are. And meanwhile, the Maisels, it's a lot more individual. So Abe is very academic and has much more of the attitude that I'm familiar with about clothes in my family, which is like, well, you don't want to look like you care. You want to look like you understand how to dress nicely, but you don't want to look like you actually care. That would be frivolous. And then the Maisels are over here like, no, fashion is the lifeblood of our people in this country. Of course, we want to wear a really good suit or a really fashionable dress because that's their world. And then as far as Midge versus the extras, I think they did a really good job, like establishing the character of the various parts of New York City through what people were wearing. Like Midge has her very clear visual identity. She's very strongly grounded in what characterized the fashion of the 1950s, which was the Christian Dior's new look, which came around in 1947. And it's like this reaction to the austerity of World War II, and this reaction also to women having stepped into more traditionally masculine roles during World War II, during the earlier 1940s. And now this idea of both celebrating the fact that they don't need to be that austere anymore, and you can have these big skirts and these really bright colors and feel just really playful and happy with your clothes. And also this idea that like women need to go back to being ladies. So that really characterizes what Midge is wearing. She's got those colors. She's got that shape to her dresses. She's always in a very structured waist, and she's either got a big, big flared skirt or she's wearing a very hourglassy pencil skirt. That's what characterizes her. But you go around to different parts of the New York City and you see people like in the Gaslight, you see people wearing things that are the counterculture of the 1950s. You see people with more of a beatnik style. You see people especially like the folk musicians who are wearing the precursors to what would become hippie style in the 1960s and 70s. And they do a good job of setting the stage and telling you where you are and about the world you're in through people's clothes, which is the job of any historical costuming department.
Is there a costume or moment or something that comes out, that jumps out at you where you're like, oh, like the costume is telling a story right now, as well as the scene?
So there were a couple moments that Esther sort of pointed out to me, and there was one that really stood out to me in the 5th season. Where was it? Let's see. I think it was episode 8 of the 5th season. And this is an episode where the story of the season is very much about the fact that the show is prepared to confront the fact that it's 1963 and the world is changing. Previously, I think they wanted to stay in like more of the social context of the 1950s because that's what enabled them to tell the story they want to tell. But they're wrapping up and they're ready to talk about the fact that the world is changing because the show is moving on. So what I noticed in this is you have this scene where Midge is having this college reunion and meeting up with her college friends. And there's a lot of things that just stood out to me. So the shape of these 4 or 5 women's dresses that you see together for most of that set of scenes is definitely much more 1960s than a lot of the things we've seen. The 1950s, you see a lot of this very structured hourglass bodice, and there's like obviously some sort of girdle or shapewear or corsetry going on under there to give it that shape. And then here we see the bodices and the skirts are much more straight up and down. Not everybody's, but somewhat. They're all in dresses that have basically the same silhouette, like the same shape, the same cut, even though some of them are wearing slightly different sets of tops and skirts. Everybody but Midge is wearing like a monochrome, totally color coordinated, same color throughout the whole outfit. And it's very soft colors. There's pastel blue and there's this very gentle green floral print, and someone's wearing soft peach. And then Midge is there and she's wearing two different colors, and she's wearing painfully bright hot pink and she's wearing very sharp navy blue. And it makes her stand out from these women because this scene is all about how her life has diverged from what was expected of her, being cut from the same cloth as these other girls. But she's gone in a very different direction.
Literally.
Yeah, like pun fully intended. I meant to say that. So she's got that silhouette in common. She's got that same background, but now she's in these very strong, almost aggressive colors. She's very sharp in her look compared to the other women who are wearing softer outfits because she's struck out on her own and she's being a single mom. She's divorced. She's doing this very different thing from her life. And these other women have followed much more the path that was expected of them. So it's highlighting the similarities and the differences at once, just in that set of outfits. I also really enjoyed seeing the difference when they go and look in the old dorm room and you've got these two like 1963 younger college girls there. And both of them are wearing shorts, not skirts. And one of them has got a much, much more classic, like 1960s hairstyle. And it's half up and she's got the little bump on top and it's longer and it only curls at the bottom. Mm-hmm. It's not a 50s hairstyle at all. And that contrast between these now 30-year-old women who are starting, to dress like it's the 60s, but the sheer degree of contrast between the college girls and Midge and her friends is wonderful. It really sets that apart. And it fits with the tone of the episode because this is also the episode where Midge's dad, Abe, has his whole epiphany about the world having changed from the set of expectations that he was given in his formative time. And having all of that highlighted in this completely separate scene just through the clothes is really, really good storytelling. And that's what costuming should do for a period drama. It's another way of telling the story.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad because I thought it and I was like, we need a costume expert on this show just so we can talk about that scene alone. It's so good. It's so good for exactly what you're saying. You're like, you could watch it on mute and just know exactly what the tone is. Like the fact that they're like Midge's life hasn't even started yet and someone's calling her old just from the clothing and the fact that she doesn't understand why they don't want to vacuum. And she's like, oh my God, like I'm like, this is crazy. And it's just so exciting because I think the only scene I felt that way about must have been maybe the first season or second season when they're in, I'm not a New York person. Was it Washington Square Park where there's like a rally going on, the women's rights rally, yes. And she has no idea what is going on. And even the women there, they look more grounded in their colors and in the things that they're wearing. It's more logistical. They're not going to march around in heels, right? And here she is just sticking out like a sore thumb. And it's like, it's really exciting when a show can do something like that.
Yeah, they use how strongly Midge's look aligns with like the classic new look to really differentiate her. And she often wears like these stronger, bright, cheerful colors more than the people around her. And I think it's an especially interesting contrast when you put her and Susie next to each other. And it's like this very like 1950s aggressively feminine ladylike person who loves clothes to the point where it is a recurring joke on the show that she's absolutely ridiculous about clothes. And then you have Susie, who for most of the season is wearing not just menswear, not just this very butch style. It's shabby and it's not necessarily well coordinated. But in like to dress the way she does, though, the thing about Susie, it's not that she doesn't care, because if she didn't care, she would not be doing anything so strongly transgressive as wearing menswear as a woman in the 1950s. That is not the fashion sense of somebody who does not actually care about clothes. But she has this transition in the fifth in the like 5th season, where she goes from earlier and she's wearing this very shabby and sometimes like not well cared for, worn out, not well coordinated menswear stuff. And you get the sense that she's dressing this way because this is what is most comfortable for her, but she still doesn't feel like she has the budget to own it. She doesn't feel like she has the budget for it to be a positive experience for her. It's just the least negative option. This is what she feels most comfortable with, but she doesn't really feel good about her clothes. And then you have this moment where her agency, like her management business, is coming into its own. And instead of like this very classic period drama scene where you have a female character and she's being successful and she puts on a beautiful dress for the first time and she has that emotional experience of looking at the dress and looking at herself in the mirror, what does Susie do? She goes and gets fitted for a really high quality suit. And it's the same scene. It's the same emotional impact for the character. It's the same looking at the mirror and being like, oh my goodness, I have achieved what I wanted to achieve in my life and I am coming up in the world. But she's Susie and she gets to have this experience without needing to change who she is because she's not going to go and put on a dress. That's not her. She's going to take what she's already doing and what's already most comfortable for her, and she's going to do it well. And that's the suit. And that's what I love about the writing of that scene, is it's a way of telling us about the character in a way that's really true to them.
It's still really, it's still a glow up. It's just still true to character. Is it rare? Was it common? Was it just because it wasn't in the mainstream didn't mean it wasn't happening? But is that something that would happen? Would women wear suits if they wanted to?
I think it would be seen as transgressive, and that also doesn't mean it didn't happen. I think, so I'm not as much of an expert on this, but I have seen a lot of commentary basically saying that they nailed it as far as Susie's look for a butch lesbian in that time period and in her social circles. And yeah, I definitely would not say that just because it was seen as transgressive doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
There have always been people who have looked at the gender roles imposed on them by society and the clothing used to signify and enforce those gender roles and said, this doesn't fit and I am going to find a way to do what I need to do that works for me.
I want to drill down into that a little bit about the gender roles and about the role that fashion plays in constraining populations from, well, I think I'm actually talking mostly about gender, but like you talked about before with racial element of like keeping people down by making them dress a certain way or closing them off from dressing a certain way. We were talking about the times in Maisel where fashion is not just present, but it's called out. So like, you know, when everybody thinks Susie's a man because of how she dresses, or Midge tells Lenny that she can't sit down because she's wearing her show corset, right? And then there's another one where she goes to the writer's room and she explains why she has to change because one of the dresses is not a going on late night dress. And there's another point where she says she has to wear something she can sit down in because, you know, she tells Susie, I have to wear a sitting skirt as opposed to a standing skirt. So all of this stuff is something that Midge is aware of. And I'm wondering just in terms of how corsets, you know, and other kinds of women's wear exists in this world and how, what am I saying? So we're going to have the corset talk. Yes, we're going to have the corset talk. And I am not a person who really knows a lot about fashion or cares, quite frankly. I guess I'm more of a Susie in that respect than a Maisel, than a Midge. But I think, you know, the idea of corsets and shapewear and what was the other? Girdle, right? Those are the three you talked about. So I don't even really see a difference among all of those things. So tell us a little bit about how the corsets operated and when they left women's fashion and how that intersects with what women were able to do in society.
Cool. So I have made a large number of videos on my YouTube channel discussing sort of both the realities of corsetry. And I've made 19th century corsets and I've worn them. And I've found them both comfortable and uncomfortable. And also talking about like the ideas we as a society have about corsets from various time periods. And as far as in Maisel and in the 1950s, I found it really interesting that in the first episode, she goes up and she does her drunk first comedy set right after her husband leaves her. And she calls out 1950s shapewear with the word corset, which is not a word that was really used in the 1950s. You would talk about your girdle, or you would talk about your bustier. It was shapewear, but it was still made with a lot of the construction techniques used for corsetry. So it's not necessarily that corsetry died, it's that corsetry evolved, or at least it had by that point. What I do always have to remind people about corsetry is even when you go back as far as like the first things that we would look at and call corsets in the late 16th century, the Renaissance Faire sort of period, you're talking about bras with back support for better and for worse. If it fit you well and if it was designed for moving around in, it was incredibly comfortable. And if it fit you badly, or if it was designed for an extreme look and comfort wasn't a consideration, yeah, they could get really uncomfortable. And this is true of any form of shapewear. So like there are bras that have put me in just as much pain as badly fitted corsets. And that's going to hold true for the shapewear in Maisel. So I don't think this is a situation where like women were universally constrained for doing anything because they were all expected to wear corsets. That wasn't true in the 19th century. There were corsets that women did work in. They were really helpful because they gave you that back support. And this was also true in the 1950s. Some people didn't wear this really intense shapewear. What I like about the way Midge has her relationship with fashion and shapewear is she knows exactly what she's doing. When she puts on this really intense girdle or corset or piece of foundation underwear, she knows that this is an extreme. And it's in character for her because she is someone who takes fashion to extremes. So I spoke about the show corset scene in a video where I sort of dissected all of these scenes discussing corsets and putting them on and taking them off in period dramas. And what I really like about that scene is she talks about the corset in a very in-character way. It's completely in character for her to be wearing this crazy intense piece of shapewear because she's ordinarily someone who takes fashion to extremes and she's just been performing. So she's in her really intense shapewear. But it doesn't turn, like we barely see the corset. It doesn't turn into one of those like a woman is in pain and it's sexy because she's in pain situations. She's very matter of fact about that. And so the corset is not even really about the corset. The corset is a thing for her and Lenny to talk about because they want to flirt with each other. And this is the subject they choose. I think that scene is really well written in that respect because it's in character, it's consistent with Midge's character, and it doesn't fall into that trap of like, oh my goodness, all corsets are painful and impossible for anything to do, or for anyone to do anything in, because we know this is an unusual situation in somebody who's taking fashion to extremes. And we don't see like the pained gasping or the lacing marks or any of that. It's there. She knows what she's doing and she's making this choice from a place of having decided this is how she wants to dress.
Agency. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What this is making me think of, like my absolute ideal corset scene that I would like to see in a period drama. I want to see like some 19th century power couple or something. And they're going out to some really intense social or business event or something. And they're getting dressed together and you see the guy's tying his tie and they're like talking to each other and being cute and supportive about whatever's about to happen. And the husband walks over and just like helps his wife tie her corset. Not tight lacing or anything. He's just like, here, I can stand behind you. I can do this faster than you can.
Almost like a Nora Ephron scene where it's like more logistical and like, hey, how is your day? Oh, this is nervous. Oh, don't forget. I like that. I want that for you.
Yeah, it's like I want it to be like very supportive. And it's this thing where they're like armoring up to go out into the social world and do battle and be a power couple together and helping themselves get their like outside public faces on through getting dressed in a very supportive way that's like positive for their relationship. I want to see that. It hasn't happened yet to my knowledge.
I feel like the only thing you can compare it to is like when someone steps into a dress and the guy zips it up. But like, it's so not complicated. It needs to be more complicated.
Yeah.
So what's next for you now that you're done with the fellowship and you've dropped the last episode in the series, right? That went up today, if I'm not
Yes.
if I'm correct. So what's next on your agenda, and how can people best find your work?
All right. So you can find me on YouTube, Snappy Dragon, all one word. You can find me on Instagram, Miss Snappy Dragon. You can find me also on Facebook and TikTok, Miss Snappy Dragon. I will be posting some just like follow-up content for the series, which I'm really excited about. I want to get a little bit more into the locations that we toured for episode 6, which I had the organizations we worked with were so amazing. The guides we worked with were so amazing. I had a really, really hard time cutting that episode down to half an hour, and the Patreon extended cut, which, by the way, I have a Patreon if you want all of the bonus extended cuts and the source notes and the behind the scenes content. That is SnappyDragonStudios, patreon.com/SnappyDragonStudios. And I had such a hard time cutting the YouTube version down to half an hour. The Patreon version is 17 minutes longer, because I had to put all of that extra good stuff somewhere. What comes next for me? I would like some rest. I had my first like proper day where I did not do anything work related at all this past Saturday. So I would like some rest. I would like to sleep. I would like to build my little garden on my balcony, and I would like to do some household sewing projects. I'm really excited to be able to get back to some of the content that I make as like my bread and butter, my regular stuff, because this series has been a bit of a departure for me. And I love this. And I loved being able to make sewing videos again. And I loved this digging deeper, like spending 6 episodes on one project. And I was looking at my list of ideas the other day, and I was like, I really, really want to make this video I've been thinking of about Victorian attitudes towards modesty, and this rant I have about how that compares to school dress codes today. Like, I want to be able to talk about fashion and social issues.
We love to see that.
It's what I do. It's what I'm here for. And I'm also going to start like the very early stages of planning on my next big project, which I don't want to say too much about. It's not going to be specifically like a project that's about Jewish identity. I really dislike the thing where creators and artists of marginalized backgrounds get sort of pigeonholed into making work that is only about the way in which they are marginalized. But I also looked at the group of people that I want to be working with for this big project and was like, all of these people are Jewish. I didn't choose them because they were Jewish, but they all are. And I think that's going to end up coming through in some respects. So it's going to be a big departure from my previous work, because it's not going to be quite as focused on costuming. There will be a lot of historical costumes. There will be an entire cast of people in historical costumes. I just probably won't have made them all. There will be Shakespeare. There will be a Renaissance Fair.
Beautiful.
All right.
So that's
can't wait.
Hopefully starting to work on that this summer. Hopefully that's coming in 2024.
Awesome.
I love that for you. Congratulations on everything you've done. And I'm also really excited to hear that you're resting in the middle of all that, because I feel like that's really important. And not everyone says that. They're like, I'm going to do this next thing. And that's great. But I also like that you're relaxing and doing the things that make joy for you.
I have to. I have chronic health issues. If I don't choose to rest, I will not get a choice. And that's not very fun.
Right. Schedule your rest, lest it be scheduled for you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being with us. This was so fun.
Thank you for coming today. We really appreciate it. It was so fun. We're never going to look at clothes on screen the same way again.
Thank you. It was really fun to come on here and chat about you. And you guys asked such great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's our job. We often ask our guests if they were a bagel, what kind of bagel they would be, or what kind of bagel they prefer and why.
So, okay. My bagel order is, oh my goodness, this is so hilariously reflective of the sort of person I am. My bagel order is pretty much always a plain bagel toasted with plain cream cheese, which is very boring, and it's just what I like. It has to be a really good bagel, though, if it's plain, because otherwise it's just going to be a disappointment. It's got to be a really quality bagel. So I think if I was a bagel, I probably would be a plain bagel toasted with cream cheese, but it would be like, I don't know, there would be some interesting color in it. Like it would have a little bit of food dye. Maybe not a full-on rainbow bagel, because in most of my social circles, like I am the square. Like that's me. And I do my best not to be an actual boring person, but like compared to the people I hang out with, yeah, I'm the square. I own it.
But you know, there's squagles. There's also like square bagels. You've never seen those?
Bagels?
Oh, where there's a will, there's
I'm a
a
rainbow
way.
square bagel. That's what I am.
Well, you know, you like what you like. And, you know, given your work, I'm sure that your plain bagel will have some sort of adornment, maybe brass buttons with a little Star of David in them, or maybe you like put on the schmear in the shape of a 6-pointed star. I don't know.
Perfect.
I feel like you're gonna zhuzh it a little bit so that it's more accurate. But yes, thank you for sharing that with us. That is exactly why we asked the question, because it's about like trying to figure out how people view themselves and why they like the things that they like. So thank you for answering that.
Of course.
And thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
This has been The Bagel Report, a production of Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California, and a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network. Thank you to Lev Gringaz, our producer from Jew Folk Inc., David A.M. Walensky and Andrew Essenston, and Danny Lipsky for creating our logo. You can find us wherever podcasts are listened to. Connect with us on social, on Twitter, at Esther K., at Eben Moshe, and at The Bagel Report, on Instagram at Esther Kostanowitz, at Eben Moshe, and TBR the Pod, and by emailing us at thebagelreport@gmail.com. Now go and watch something interesting, and maybe we'll talk about it next time on The Bagel Report.